let's start with the background of basically like, why are we in this situation? Okay. If you listen to this show, you know that I love talking about the business of college football, the television side of things. And this was and is a business decision. And it's born out of a very tried and true business model in terms of this television revenue distribution in the conferences, but it's also born out of a shifting business model. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, the first thing I mean is that if you take a look at the conference television deals from 10 years ago, and we've talked about this on the show, they all looked very similar. And the reason is because what was driving value a decade ago or a little over a decade ago was quantity. And that was the case because the business model was about cable subscriber fees. Okay, there was roughly 110 to about 120 million cable homes in the United States. And so it was about getting the biggest markets possible to then have a channel and have subscriber fees so that you could get the biggest potential revenue based on those subscriber fees. Now, what's happened in the last decade is obvious. We all know that cord cutting started to happen. So what happened is that the revenue stream went away from quantity and it went towards now quality. So the money in the industry had to get smarter. We've been over this again, and I've given you these numbers. If you take a look at the most watched game in terms of a conference matchup in every one of the conferences, you see that the Big Ten and the SEC have massive audiences for their biggest games. Michigan, Ohio State, over 17 million. Tennessee, Alabama, over 13 million. Like, these are massive audiences. And then you get to every other conference, and all of those games, even the biggest games in those conferences, they pale in comparison. Just over 5 million for the ACC and just over 4.5 million for really both the Big 12 and the Pac-12. So because of that, what happened? Well, there was a pie. There was a pie of dollars that networks were going to spend on live sports. And that pie is being gobbled up by the things that are going to drive the most eyeballs: the NFL, the Big Ten, and the SEC. So it's not that the pie is growing, is that pie is being divided in ever increasing sections to those three entities. The NFL alone is charging $1 billion more annually to the networks out there just because they can. And that's not even for more inventory. That's just because of the NFL's popularity. Well, the Big Ten and the SEC got massive television contracts. Why? Because they drive the quantity of eyeballs. Because those live appointment viewings, that's what's most valuable. It's no longer about the quantity of the cable bundle anymore. Now there's just over 60 million homes in the United States that actually have the traditional cable bundle. So that business model is totally fledgling. So there's this pie of money. It's being divided into where you're going to get the most eyeballs, and everybody else has to fight for the scraps. Well, the ACC didn't have a deal to be negotiated because their grant of rights is going into the mid-30s. All of this to tell you there was basically enough pie for one television deal, and there were two entities fighting over it: the Pac-12 and the Big 12. Okay, so that's, you get a big picture discussion about, well, like, why are we in this position? Well, we're in this position because there was one television deal to be had between the Pac-12 and the Big 12. All right. These two conferences had very different outlooks about this situation, this reality that I was just discussing to you. The Pac-12 had this view, and maybe it's because of their location, maybe it's because of what's been going on for the last, 5-8 years in this conference. Their conference headquarters had been in San Francisco near Silicon Valley. They had this notion that it's like, no, the pie is actually much bigger than it is, and there's bigger deals to be had because of streamers. And don't worry, we're going to be rescued and our deal is going to be bigger because of streamers and technology. Okay. So they thought that the pie was actually bigger than it was. The Big 12's viewpoint was actually more, I would call it, rooted in reality, which was they needed to get to the table first and eat first. And so they did. Brett Yormark's decision and the Big 12's leadership's decision to get to that deal first is why we are here. When he talked to me for Big Noon Conversations, he said as such, he said it was the most imperative thing that we had to do was go out there and solidify the deal with the traditional partners, ESPN and Fox, so that we had stability. And that stability, as you will, see during the course of this podcast, was paramount in everything that happened with Colorado. So he gets the stability that he wants, Brett Yormark and the Big 12 Conference. And then the Pac-12 has these visions of some saving grace from a streamer that really hasn't materialized. And now all of a sudden, the one deal to be had has been had by the Big 12. So they not only get the resources of that pie, the only resources left out there to spend on live sports, but they also get the exposure. And it's the exposure that is the traditional exposure that most college football fans expect, which is the two biggest and most premier college football networks out there, which is ESPN, obviously, which almost made college football, and Fox Sports. And so there we are. All of a sudden, the Big 12 has this amazing amount of stability and exposure. Well, that's going to be very valuable then as we move forward. Okay, now let's take a look at the Pac-12's issues. I talked a little bit about the way that they viewed what was going on in the marketplace and how that was a problem. Well, that was a problem because immediately once the Big 12 solidified their television deal, all that mattered for the remaining schools in the Pac-12 conference, the 10 schools, obviously, after USC and UCLA moved to the Big 10, all that mattered was, okay, what does our deal look like? What's the number? That's the question. If you talked with anybody around the league, if you talked with anybody in leadership, that's what they asked. What's the number? And if you go back to October of last year, there was some communication about that number being fairly large and somewhere much north of what the Big 12 had just negotiated and something just under what the Big 10 had just negotiated. But that number was never real because the deals never came to fruition. And because of that, it just kept getting pushed out a later date, pushed out further and further and further. And there's a framework of a deal. And well, okay, we can't announce because there's nothing done. Well, now there's another framework of a deal, but we've got to push it out. And all the schools were asking for was some stability. Okay, what is our deal? Who's it with? What's the number? What's a general idea of what's going to be happening? And it never materialized. And it got pushed out so long that I believe last week was the straw that broke the camel's back, at least from the Colorado perspective, when at Pac-12 Media Days, George Klavkov says, the longer we wait on a deal, the more options we have. That's just not the case. That's just not the case. If there were that many options, they would have been solidified. There would be concrete offers, and there would be actual figures that these schools could work off of. And it's just not what has happened. So could have this been avoided? Possibly if they were to get a deal. But really the deal to be had was the one with the traditional exposure, which is what the Big 12 jumped the Pac-12 for all the way back last year when they were able to sign the deal with ESPN and Fox. I actually think that the schools, when you actually think about it in that sense, after you hear me break it down like that, the schools, then you could make a strong argument, have shown a tremendous amount of patience in this whole situation. And in particular, in a really precarious spot because this revenue is paramount for these schools and these programs to continue.